class, and welcome back. Obviously this isn't how I thought we'd be back, but here we are. Now what we're going to be covering today is chapter 16. So we're talking about modern US history, parts of history where we were actually both alive. You guys in the 2000s, me in the 80s, but as far as today we're going to be talking about the 1970s. So that means we're going to talk about the presidencies of one Richard Milhouse Nixon, his successor Gerald Ford, and the peanut farmer from Georgia, Jimmy Carter. Now, the one thing that's in common about each of these three presidents is that essentially America is going to hate them. As weird as that sounds, there was a high level of distrust among the American presidency. It certainly started, as we talked about, in the presidency of one Lyndon B. Johnson, but due to the actions of one Richard Nixon, that would be compounded, not to mention made even worse by his successor, Gerald Ford, and of course Jimmy Carter. Now, these are due to a number of issues, and they're not necessarily the president's fault when it happens. But the American people won't see it that way, so we have to discuss and look into why the American people had such a high distrust of government during the 1970s. Now, we're going to begin, I know we just said that we're going to talk about why they're distrustful or whatnot, but I want to talk about the successes, especially about Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon ran in 1968 on a promise of ending the war, and even then in his re-election in 1972, he still has to talk about ending the war, the Vietnam War. However, we need to talk about what that policy was that enabled him to be in that position to actually end the war. Now, during his first term as president, Nixon pursues a new type of foreign policy known as detente. Now, what detente meant is an easing of relations. So gone are the days of trying to just threaten gloom and doom when it comes to the Soviets and our relationship with them. Instead of trying to one-up them by saying we have more nuclear weapons or that we're going to use said nuclear weapons on them, instead Nixon pursues a relationship of, hey, let me talk to you on the phone instead. Let me actually try and talk to you. Let me talk. Because if we talk, then we're not throwing punches. If we can get to the table and talk, then things can be a lot better. Now, one of the things that occurs out of this is that there actually will be progress when it comes to our relationship with the Soviet Union. Now, Richard Nixon would be the first president to actually visit the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union would return the favor with their leader, the premier, coming over to the United States. Now, the big accomplishment of this relationship is the introduction of the SALT Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Now, what this treaty promised to do was to reduce the massive amount of nuclear weapon stockpiles that the two countries had amassed. We agreed to stop building new weapons and agreed to future cooperation, especially in the space race, which was actually rather comforting for two countries that were always talking about bringing an end to the war. The idea that the two of them could come to cooperate together, especially in the highly contested space race, is quite the incredible feat. Now, in addition to meeting with the Soviet Union, we would also begin to meet with China. Now, the way that we began to meet with China is a bit interesting to say the least. Now, China had a falling out regarding its relationship with the Soviet Union, and like a guy seeing a girl that's broken up with her boyfriend on Instagram, we slid right on into the DMs and then tried to get in on the action. Now, what we began to do was by offering China economic help, and especially help in the areas of manufacturing. So, Richard Nixon would become the first president to ever visit China. And in his visit with China, he would bring with him American businessmen. These American businessmen, as obviously Richard Nixon as well, would help to forge a new relationship with China. And China became an economic partner of the United States. So regardless of how you view the relationship between China and the United States today, it's largely due in part thanks to Richard Nixon and the policy of detente. The idea that we're going to talk with them allowed us to begin to create a relationship, whether or not you view that's a beneficial one now or whatnot, but it is important to note that opening the doors to communication obviously created a mutual form of understanding and cooperation, whether it was the space race, and the formal ending of that, and future cooperation, and actually striking up a relationship with China is immensely beneficial to the United States policy at this time. However, and there's always a however when it comes to US history, remember, when we talk about Nixon, there's one thing that always comes to mind. It's not about Vietnam, it's not about his policy with China, it's instead, well, we always remember the Watergate scandal. Now, to kind of break this down, what the Watergate scandal was that members of the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, on behalf of Richard Nixon, broke into the Watergate Hotel, where the Democratic National Committee had kept its headquarters. Now, we don't know whether or not Nixon had any role in actually telling his men to go and do that, or if he actually knew that what they were trying to do, but what we do know is that Nixon covered it up. And unfortunately for Nixon, he was very deeply paranoid, especially after the release of the Pentagon Papers, so he had a hit list of sorts of every person that was disloyal to him and kept tabs on them. Unfortunately, the keeping of those tabs also then recorded every single conversation in his White House, which gave bounds and bounds of evidence as to his guilt in covering up the crime committed at the Watergate Hotel. Now, what will then happen is that Congress will then sue for the right to those records in its investigation, and the Supreme Court will ultimately hand them over, in the case of the United States v. Nixon in 1973. However, once the information is looked over and Congress is getting ready to file for articles of impeachment, Nixon will decide to resign and then faithfully leave the White House stating, "I am not a crook," when very clearly he was. Now, with the president resigned, that then leaves the question, who then becomes president? Well, that's only one part of the problems for Richard Nixon. Now, prior to Nixon resigning and shortly after his re-election, his vice president, a man by the name of Spiro Agnew, had some issues with the IRS and tax fraud, causing him to resign prior to the Watergate scandal even breaking. That then brought in the Michigan Congressman Gerald Ford. Now, Gerald Ford, who has been unelected and appointed to the vice presidency, now finds himself at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, living in the White House, now as president. So what is this guy who was never elected to the office of vice president, let alone president, going to do as president? Unfortunately for Gerald Ford, he is not going to handle things in the best of situations. Now, one blunder wasn't enough for Gerald Ford, and he then went on a series of missteps that were actually no fault of his own, but again, he is going to get the blame for them. Now, the United States had a policy of supporting Israel in its quest for independence and autonomy and grabs for land within the region. Now, after a series of wars in which the United States backed Israel over its Middle Eastern neighbors, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, better known as OPEC, had held an embargo against the United States, not allowing them to purchase oil from Middle Eastern states due to the United States' support of Israel in these wars. What this led to was gas shortages across the country, not to mention a spike in prices. As you can see in the image below, well, gas went for about $3.86, the equivalent today of around $8 a gallon. Adding to that misery was the fact that due to the gas shortages, you weren't allowed to buy gas at any time that you wanted. You had to go on your assigned day. So not only was gas expensive, but you couldn't even have it readily available. And this just made the presidency of Gerald Ford look that much worse. In addition, it held one other consequence. It nearly led to the death of American manufacturing and definitely contributes to the way that manufacturing is in the United States today. Now, during this time period, if you remember, we had the Marshall Plan, where the United States sent over money and aid to countries in order to combat communism, largely in those countries that we helped to defend in World War II, so those of Western Europe, not to mention Japan. Now, the thing is, as part of that aid, we aided their manufacturing, and many of these companies, or countries, especially Japan, would focus on automobile manufacturing. Now, these cars were unpopular at first in the United States and didn't really sell very well. However, in the face of a gas shortage, these smaller cars, especially in comparison to the American counterparts, fared much better because they got better gas mileage. And due to the American auto industry failing to really respond to this, soon European and Japanese automobiles began to outsell American cars, largely due to this, and this is the starting point of that. Now, if that didn't make matters worse, things certainly got as bad as they could get in 1975. If you remember from our talk about Vietnam, that is the year where South Vietnam will fall to the Viet Cong after the failure of the ceasefire from the Paris Peace Accords, and Vietnam will be united in a communist government. Not to mention that Cambodia will also fall to a communist government. It is a series of missteps during the Gerald Ford administration that makes him look particularly weak to communism, which is something you can't really be in an American election, especially in the mid-1970s. Now, it isn't all bad for Gerald Ford. He does negotiate the Helsinki Accords, which properly sets all the borders of Europe, and a bottom line as far as human rights are concerned, even in communist countries. As far as how all of those are followed, well, at least they got the agreement out of it. But as you might imagine, going into 1976, the failures of the Gerald Ford administration are going to lead to many issues and complicating his re-election. Needless to say, he is not going to be re-elected, but instead will be defeated in the election of 1976 by the governor of Georgia, a former peanut farmer by the name of Jimmy Carter. Now, once he has been elected, Jimmy Carter will set forth his agenda, which is to restore American morality. Now, he does this by trying to correct America's missteps, so to speak, and trying to actually deal with a lot of the issues that America has caused. For example, he recognizes American imperialism and decides to give back the Panama Canal and control of it back to Panama. And that exchange will be done in 1999. I know it's far off in the future, but yes, it's a transitional period and he does do that, and he organizes for that treaty to be done. In addition, and probably his biggest accomplishment, is the quote-unquote peace in the Middle East deal via the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. Now, the Camp David Accords is a huge milestone in U.S. diplomacy, not to mention in Middle Eastern relations. Now, what this agreement did was that Egypt became the first country to officially recognize Israel's right to existence and right as a nation. In addition, this treaty will allow for peace between the two countries by paying them $4 billion a year. Yes, I know that seems kind of ridiculous to pay out countries so they won't fight each other, but since this agreement in the late 1970s, Israel and Egypt have not fought whatsoever. The policy has worked, and the two work together to try and establish peace, albeit there has been some, well, sidestepping here and there, but relations between the two countries has largely been peaceful ever since. And it is largely thanks to the negotiating of Jimmy Carter to get these two sides to come together and actually get them to stop fighting and recognize one another. And we realize the price of peace in the Middle East is about $4 billion a year. Now, unfortunately, as you might guess, things are not going to be completely smooth for Jimmy Carter, as kind of been the history here of the 1970s. Now, in 1979, the policy of detente kind of falls apart once the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Now, in that same year, it becomes the Carter Doctrine to try and aid anyone who is fighting against the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, what this means is arming anyone who fights against them, including a group known as the Mujahideen. Now, the Mujahideen are a group of fighters within Afghanistan trying to push back against the Soviets. Now, the Mujahideen, you may not know them by that name today, because today they're known as the Taliban. So we kind of gave weapons to what would become the Taliban. They were Soviet, so it's okay. Now, the thing is, the policy of detente is now dead, and then in 1980 we refused to go to the Olympics because they're being hosted in Moscow. Due to the invasion of Afghanistan, we then organized other countries to not go to the 1980 Olympics, and as you might then imagine, the Soviets would do the same thing to us later in 4 years when the Olympics were being held in Los Angeles. The biggest problem of Carter's presidency, though, would have to be the Iran hostage crisis. Now, in 1979, the pro-Western leader of Iran, known as the Shah, would flee the country following the Iranian Revolution, which establishes a theocratic government, a government based on their religion of Shia Islam. Now, following the revolution, the Shah would later flee to the United States in order to receive medical care. Now, this threw people into a frenzy And in anger at the United States, they would storm the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Now, inside, people were kept hostage, and they would be kept there for over a year, until January 20th, 1981 to be exact. Now, what this meant for Carter's presidency was that he was being viewed and portrayed as being extremely weak. You had the issues of yet another oil crisis following the 1979 Iranian Revolution. You had the storming of the embassy, not to mention the failure of numerous other issues with the Carter administration. Also crippling hyperinflation and high unemployment that led to a deeply unpopular president. So when it comes time for 1980, Americans want a strongman, someone who will stand up to communists and any other threat that the United States may have. So they're going to turn to an actor. They're going to turn to a guy who ran the state of California as a governor. They're going to turn to Ronald Reagan. So that brings us to an end for section 1 here. In tomorrow's notes, we will go over section 2, where we go over the 1980s and 90s. So we're going to talk about the presidencies of Ronald Reagan, his vice president and future president, George H.W. Bush, and of course, Bill Clinton. So thank you guys for watching, and now please answer the questions that are on Schoology. Thank you.